Hi everyone. So, welcome to the most recent lecture. Um, we have a number of readings this week, a variety of material. So we have Jane Elliott's The Eye of the Storm, the two pieces by Shireen Razak, a piece by Dara Culhane, and then there is the film Home Feelings, A Struggle for Community by Jennifer Hodge de Silva. What I'll say briefly, because I do want to cut this into pieces, this lecture into chunks, as it were. And I will say a little bit about the film by Jane Elliott, Eye of the Storm, 1970. And I open that up in order to talk a little bit about racialization and to talk a little bit about the process of racialization. Racialization is essentially a marking process, assigning particular bodies and particular communities to a space of inferiority, of deviancy, of degeneracy, to take up Shireen Razak's terminology. So it is the state then, those who have the power to assign, mark particular communities and particular bodies for, along those lines, for punishment, for discipline, for containments, for surveillance, for extermination. And what you see in that classroom there is occurring there with brown eyes, blue eyes, and also the assignment of the piece of material that is blue upon the body so that they can be marked for treatment, for differential treatment, for punishment, for segregation. You find that it is racialization is an invention, right? It is a set of imaginings, those who are deemed to be a threat to the power structure are marked collectively in inventive ways. It is not a question of the body and difference. It is a question of the evaluations that are placed upon those particular bodies, right? And those communities, and their ways of doing and their ways of knowing, right? So racialization, there is a power that assigns that marking. And it is a marking that, of course, as you see in the classroom there, is not about the individual that is marked. The individual is marked as a member. So there's a whole collective there in the classroom that is deemed to be inferior. It is, of course, replicating of relationships of power, colonial relations of power locally and globally, who are deemed to be inferior as a collective in terms of their morality, their characteristics, their behaviors, deemed to be inferior, deemed to be criminal, right? Deemed to be primitive, uncivilized. And what we find then, in what we can see being taken up in the film there, is of course that there is also an identity process working there. And so those that can do the assigning develop their sense of identity through that process, which is a process of violence, developing their sense of self through violence and through domination, which has continuously be generated, be put into practice, be acted upon, right? By the oppressor. So I'll say more on that in the next installment. I'm in the park right now, and what I want to talk about when we think about some of this material, particularly by Razak and by Cohen, I want to. I've been thinking a little bit about mourning. When I read through that material, I think about mourning. I've been thinking about death and the possibility and the reclamation of mourning and who is allowed to mourn. And this is also a process of racialization, because racialization turns particular bodies and particular communities into things, right? Remember Aimé Césaire, thingification, colonization equals thingification, right? And so mourning, we see both in Razak and Culhane, we see that racialization murders, and it murders in such a way that it then justifies that murder, but also then disappears the any possibility, once you have reduced a particular people to things and objects, any possibility that there can be, that there's any recognition of the struggles and the pain and the hurt of those collectors and those communities that have been impacted by this violence, right? Culhane talks a lot about disappearance and the regimes of disappearance. But mourning, connected then to who gets to mourn, right? What kind of the ways, how do we mourn? What are we mourning for? Constructed, if we go back to the classroom, in that classroom, what counts as mourning? What is it that we, and who is it that we should be mourning for? What are the tears? What should we be tearful for? Right? What should we be shedding tears for? And maybe this is, I'm in the park here and I'm trying to figure this out in terms of my own thinking, because I don't have a set of notes down here. I don't have no PowerPoint, you know that. But it got me thinking of 2007. And in 2007, I remembered the transcripts and hearing about reading transcripts of the court proceedings of the serial killer, the court trial for the serial killer Robert Pickton. And in that court, Robert Pickton, this mass murderer in Vancouver, charged with, admitted murdering over 50 women, or close to 50 women, was initially charged with murdering 20 women, and then it went down to 6. This is throughout the 1990s on his farm in Vancouver. And after many urgings from particularly women and family members in downtown East Side Vancouver, that there was something going on there, that our peoples were missing, and the police, of course, because of the ways in which racialization had marked poor women, indigenous women in downtown East Side Vancouver as inferior, as less than, right, as not worthy, of life. It took a good deal of time before those calls and those urgings were taken up. And subsequently, when the police eventually went into the farmyard they found remains of the bodies of these precious women whose lives had been taken. And I remember it always stuck with me, one of the court hearings, one of the instances in the trial, where you had a constable, P.C. Hetherington, a white woman, and this makes connections then to intersectionalities in relation to what counts as sisterhood, right? And they're thinking of colonial rankings in relation to gender. Hetherington gave an account of her first encounter on that farm. And the writer, and this also brings the media into this, because the media is part of nurturing this the racialization of mourning, the racialization of death, wrote it in such a way that it really resonated. The words resonated in terms of the emotion that Hetherington was gripped by on that encounter, and also the emotion that was displayed in that courtroom. And it was an account of Hetherington, account of seeing bodies in the farmyard. And Hetherington's tears welled up. Hetherington began to sob and began to be visibly shaken, traumatized, if you like, and the account was about was a recollection of seeing bodies, fetuses of animals, of sows, of pigs, pigs' parts, body parts. And that was the entire account. And yet on that ground, in that earth, mixed up with everything, were the remains and the bodies of these precious women, these precious loved ones of families who had been dismembered. This was a sacred ground where women's lives had been taken. Blood enmeshed and entangled with land and with soil. Bodies going back to land. Everywhere you move then would have been is sacred. And sacredness we understand as that which cannot be violated, right? Inviolable, right? Inviolatable, right? And of course this is all whiteness though, right? This is the racialization of mourning and death, right? That is not only disregarded, it is just erased, it is invisibilized, that sacredness. The sows have more humanity than the poor poor women, indigenous women, black women on that side. Their presence in death on that side. And I was reminded then of also then, 5-6 years before that, 2007 moment in New York City, of course, when the World Trade Center, the two Twin Towers were destroyed in the 9/11 incident. And the care and the reverency with which the bodies of those who had died, whose lives had been lost, was palpable. Yeah. And it gripped everyone. right? We were nurtured, and we were encouraged and coaxed collectively. I say we, the whole of Turtle Island here, and globally, right? But you're thinking of the Canadian nation state and the U.S. nation state. Candles, everything, reverency, sacredness, understanding the sacredness of those lives that were in that place, that space, even though the buildings had been destroyed. Even the dust itself was perceived to be sacred because it also held the particles of those precious loved ones who had died, those human beings who had died. And yet, for the racialized in this moment, which for me, that moment in the trial there illustrated the ways in which those who are marked as things and as objects, those who are marked in racializing ways for murder, right? Murder in life and murder in death. It marked the way in which that process occurs on a daily, day-to-day basis, right? It marked the ways in which that process delivered through what we talk about as discourse, right? Stories, right? Language, right? It penetrates our bodies to the point where we can barely, where we ourselves become complicit unconsciously in invisibilizing even our own peoples. Right? And so one of the tasks then is to begin, as you see Dara Colhane do then, is to reclaim that sacredness, right? And Dara Colhane talks about these regimes of disappearance that do just that, right? Disappear indigenous women, right? Disappear black women, disappear racialized women, disappear poor women, disappear whole collectives, right? Through language, right? That dehumanizes, right? Turns people into cases, turns people into street entrenched youth at risk, right? That humanity, that humanness, right? Disappeared, right? Evacuated, right? The processes of medicalization, where the effects then and the trauma of colonization are viewed as being a problem that is in your body that needs to be treated. So poverty becomes then an outcome of drug addiction, right? Not drug addiction becoming an outcome of poverty, right? So then our bodies are then subjected to all sorts of forms of medicalization and intrusiveness, right? And segregationist tactics, incarcerationist tactics, right? Mental illness, right? Projected in the same way and produced in the same way. That is a problem for our body. It is not a logical reaction that our bodies have towards being, in relation to our navigations of this colonial violence that we are faced with on a daily, day-to-day basis. Right? The disappearance that Colhane talks about is also, that disappearance then, and this is what medicalization, pathologization does. Pathologization constructs bodies as deviant and as having a disease, right? It needs to be treated. So then, if that's the case, we ignore then, we erase and we evacuate the structural causes of our conditions. You also then erase our full sense of our whole selves in terms of how we then struggle, but how we resist against these forces. Our practices of resistance, our practices of small acts of survival, right? So Colhane talks about kinship ties, right? Neighborhood kinship ties of survival, collectives coming together to oppose, right? to resist, all disappear, right? And for me, I think, I'm going to go quickly over this, right? I mean, I tended to do a long one, and I will come back, I believe. But this takes me to then Shireen Razak's piece, right? Because Shireen Razak's piece is speaking about place, race, and space. The connections between, identity and place and space, right? We have already an understanding of particular bodies who exist in particular spaces, right, as being some of the naturally representative or naturally connected in terms of their behaviors and their characteristics with those particular spaces of poverty, right? Spaces of slum housing, etc. Right? And this is Razak's analysis, and it's an important analysis, because of course it does naturalized spaces we think about in our minds, right? In a dominant mindset of a space such as Regent Park, right? The dominant mindset has a particular image in mind. It is a particular body, right? There's a particular body in terms of thinking and a particular set of understandings that correlate around violence, right? Right. Without, and what is erased, of course, is that those places have been invented, have been constructed in order to contain people through a long history of colonial relations of power, right? Right. Particular constructions, buildings have to be built by to house workers, right? Spaces such as Regent Park, historically, these spaces constructed to contain exploited populations, right? Reserves, right? And what Shireen Razak is talking about there is important, right? Because we need to denaturalize that thinking, that racial thinking, that racialized thinking, right? We also, and this is the analysis of Pamela George and the murder of Pamela George in 1995, that the space which Pamela resides is a space that Pamela has been pushed in by 300 years of colonial violence, particularly waged against women and children, right? Pushed into that space, the stroll, right, in Regina, right, Saskatchewan. And where that then becomes naturalized, then the two areas here that has become naturalized, so the bodies and the people in the community there is viewed as being there because they are lazy, they are dirty, they are primitive, etc. And therefore, what occurs in those spaces is violence, and violence where violence can be routinely carried out, right? Violence routinely occurs and it can be routinely carried out. And that's Shireen Razak's analysis, and it is an important analysis because that is an analysis of how these murderers then, view themselves. They view themselves as not being from that space. They view themselves as being from this privileged white space, right? A white space of civility, of progressiveness, and they can go into the space that is Pamela's and do violence there. Because violence, again, that's a space where all forms of civility, all forms of respectability are suspended. And then they come back to their own space. Right? Now, I'm not going to go through all of that, but what I would say is that as important as it is, and you have also Shireen Razak talking about unmapping, and and this then becomes important because also we think about the ways in which we think about some of the instances, the descriptions, rather, the examples that I've just spoken about, when Shireen Razak talks about, and that framework of analysis talks about the ways in which particular bodies and particular communities have had these stories of inferiority mapped onto our bodies, then the concept of a mapping means then that it's there's potential there and usefulness there in terms of thinking about how then we begin to, while we are approaching particular communities, particular bodies, we think about then, we have a conscious pause in terms of thinking about what then is our psyche mapping onto those bodies and those communities, right? So then we withdraw. So this is a process of decolonization to some extent. But and again, I'm not going to go into that with too much detail, because because I think you can read that and analyze that for yourselves. The racialization of space connected to bodies, right? Bodies that are consigned to those spaces of inferiority, right? Spaces of criminality, right? So if I'm from a particular space, one time I lived on a similar space. It was a housing project, right? When I left that space in the UK, and this was I was known in that particular town, but when I left that space, many of the folks who were part of that space also left and went to the town centre. They were viewed as being out of their place, right? They were viewed as being criminal, right? And had to be surveilled and had to be policed, right? And we see the same with racialized bodies, right? We see the same with black, indigenous bodies, right? You know, brown bodies in public spaces, on the subway, etc., right? You know, basically being marked and being surveilled because they're viewed as being out of their place, right? They are now in our space and place, right? And they must be kept in their place. I mean, racialization is about really, essentially, keeping people in their place, right? Keeping bodies in their place, right? The murder of Emmetts Till in 1955, in 1955, right? 14-year-old, young, beautiful 14-year-old black body from Chicago. Beautiful young man, right? Murdered by these white supremacists on the basis that he was supposed to whistle. Even that would be horrendous, right? You know, white children in these Disney movies can whistle and at women, and it's not a problem, right? At older women, it's not a problem. It's going to be cute, right? But Emmett also had a disability. He had a whistle movement in his mouth, right? So they murdered and tortured Emmett. And primarily, it never got caught for it, right? Never got the trial acquitted them, the murderers. And yet, what they had said was that they were looking to keep black people in that place. So it was a collective. It was an act of terror, a warning to black folks to stay in their place, right? Stay out of our place. It was a murder not by a few individuals. It was a murder by the state and a murder by the nation. And that was made clear when Emmett's mother refused to have his casket closed. Everybody could see, the nation could see, the world could see what this white supremacist system had done to her son. Right? And in that moment, Emmett spoke, right? Spoke back to power. Emmett's body spoke back to power. Right? And that is where I'm going here, because in Shireen Razak's piece, Pamela George never gets to speak, right? Pamela is silent. Pamela is erased, rendered invisible. And how would Pamela get to speak? Pamela would get to speak through what Culhane talks about in terms of those struggles, those stories of struggle, those stories of resistance, right? Those ways of knowing, the ways of doing that constitute, right, survival in relation to indigeneity against 300 years of colonial oppression, her family, her collective, her community could speak, right? Could be centered, but what you do is you center whiteness, and you center the psyches and the subjectivities of those white murderers. Pamela is never a subject. Her subjectivity never enters, is never centered in that story. So that's what we've got to be alert to, right? We've got to be alert to in terms of our analysis of power, right? So sometimes, and too often times, we can be talking about power, right? We can talk about colonial power. But we talk about it to such an extent that we center it, we give it power, right? Those who are targets of power don't get to speak, remain victims, helpless, hopeless victims. So resistance, agency, the ways in which we act and transform our world out from our own embodiments, our own ways of knowing or ways of doing, erased, rendered invisible. Even as in that material, we are talking about how racialization invisibilizes people. And we're talking about that in a critical way, but yet at the same time reproducing it, right? Through this analysis, right? An analysis by these dominant philosophers such as Michel Foucault, right? Who frankly can fuck the racialized up, right? If we use that analysis, that framework, those frameworks of analysis, right? So I'm looking around, I'm in the park here. This is Oriole Park. Let's see if I can take, this is Oriole Park Way. It is, you can have another look around here. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. Right. You have also racialized folks over here, right? In these apartment buildings. And around here, if I could just take a look here, you have the big houses, right? You know, rich people, right? Rich people. And this is a place that is on Davisville. Davisville and Young. And I live close by. And this is also a sacred place. In 2008, let's see, where are we here? In 2008, a young indigenous man, Byron Debazague, was murdered in this park. And Byron was murdered by 2 police officers, white police officers, right behind me. And I remember that night. I had just come out of working that night on putting together some anti-racism work, and I heard about it on the news. Byron was an indigenous psychiatric survivor, and Byron had taken. The claim was stolen. Two lemons from a grocery store on the corner of the street where I live. And Byron had made his way into the park here. The claims were that Byron was just singing. The claims later were that Byron might have been drunk. But from what I remember, hearing some of the witnesses, that Byron had been singing, wasn't harming anyone. The proprietor, the owner of the grocery store, called the police. Byron stole two lemons. The proprietor called the police and claimed that Byron had pulled a small knife on him. The police came and came upon Byron here and shot Byron 4 times. Shot Byron dead, murdered Byron. These police officers from 53 Division close by. And in the coronary hearing afterwards, later on, they had claimed February 2008. I'm thinking of the snow here then. The date popped up in my head. There was Byron's story in terms of being a psychiatric survivor, being a young Indigenous man, all of that erased. The officers, it had no meaning. The officers claimed that they would have done the same thing again. And they killed Byron almost at point blank, claiming that Byron came at them grunting, etc. And yet, the violence of colonization was very much the instrument with which Byron lost his life, through which Byron lost his life. Those police officers were, of course, reproducing this 300 years of murder and murderousness waged against Indigenous peoples, as they've been waged against black and racialized peoples. They claim that they would, it wouldn't matter, you know, if even if they'd taken into account some of the perhaps mitigating circumstances there, they would have still shot, still murdered Byron. They claim that they had to do that in order to safeguard the public. And we think about then who is considered to be public, right, and who is not public, right, and who is allowed in parks like this, right, and who is not, right, who is viewed as being an imposter in parks like this, public parks. Public parks here, which have been then, had boundaries placed around them, designated as public, and yet this is Indigenous land. Right? So Byron's story of being pushed out from his community, being subjected to an internal diasporic, journey, right? Movements and surveilled constantly. The fact that he is murdered for 2 lemons is the logic of this violent, racist colonial system. And it is a public park, and people are are playing. And people are moving around. And Byron Debazague is invisible. No memory. It is called Oriole Park. So we then must move then to, if we're thinking about reclamation and reclaiming the self and reclaiming the sacred, we must move then towards acting upon that reclamation process. We can do this by reclaiming even this space. You can call it the Byron Memorial, Byron Debazague Memorial Park. Right? It's something that we can and we should work for. To memorialize, to reclaim, demand recognition, right? The connection between land, embodiment, and histories of struggle and resistance. And histories of violence that the constructions around here, the buildings around here, the communities are implicated in, right? And complicit through their silence. It was only not too long over there when I had my first child was born, or my second child was my son. I had put my son down on the floor, on the grass, to photograph my son. My son was like, the baby is 7 months. The people in the wealthy houses here called the police, and I had the police screaming across the grass here. Looking to jumping out of their cars, screaming at me what was I doing, right? Who knows what was said, right? Perhaps another Karen, right? I could have been bird watching with my son. Right? These are the spaces of violence, yeah? And yet it does not belong to that, right? Even while it has been ornamentalized, the space, it is nevertheless indigenous land. So Byron goes back to land, right? So when we think about alternative and oppositional ways of knowing that, we draw upon those knowledges and those ways of knowing that enable us to mourn, right, in an anti-colonial form. Right? So reclamation right here is to understand that the trees here, right, all have memory. Right? The trees here sing, right? Byron is in those trees, Byron is in the land, and the land is in Byron. And the trees are in Byron. And the land remembers. And the trees remember. And they don't forget, and they will not forget. And so what our task is then, is to understand our connections with those bodies, with those beings, right? With all of our relations here, now, and forever. We love you, Byron. We love you. We hear you. Right? We feel you. Right? We know you. We are you.